So good morning, everybody. And thank you to Susan for that excellent background to some of the key and fundamental issues of ethics of sample sharing and data sharing. So I was asked to give my experience in terms of my involvement with a very large consortium called the H3 Africa and being a member of the Data and Biospecimen Access Committee, and also to give my experience about access to Ebola samples during the very large West African outbreak and how we've managed some of the problems there. So that's a tall order to do in 20 minutes. So I'll do my best. I won't be able to touch on all the issues, but I thought that, these are my affiliations. I'm based at my intro is a little bit outdated. I'm based at the Nigerian Institute of Medical Research. I'm an emeritus at Stellenbosch. I work with the University of the West Indies, and I've been involved in two very large consortiums that deal with sample and data access. And I'm a PI of the Global Emerging Pathogens Treatment Consortium. So sharing samples and data during routine and crisis scenarios in healthcare and research. Sharing samples and data in Africa, the context of reality in its precedential historical setting. So we're talking about access, benefit sharing, and compliance. We often forget the word compliance, so the acronym for that is ABC. This is not the same as in intellectual property rights or copyright or patenting. They're two different things. So what is ABC? It's what participants, by extension their communities, may derive or receive as compensation for their participation in global health research. And I put in bioprospecting there because there's a good analogy between human clinical research and the research that goes on in environmental studies. It is the moral, obligatory, and I put that in inverted commas, and monitored, inverted commas, action of giving a portion of the advantages or profits derived from the use of these genetic resources to the providers in the order of achieving justice for exchange. Contrarily, we may talk about exploitation or biopiracy, and that is the act of directly or indirectly gaining access to advantage by obtaining samples from the developing world, either in global health research or in bioprospecting. So we need to go back in time to what is the origin of the term benefit sharing. And it originated a long time ago in the context of what was described as common heritage of humankind. And the best example of that is how do we share the common resources that exist in international waters, for example, or in areas of the planet that do not belong to anybody, or in the celestial bodies like the planets, or in the core of the earth. So supposing we find something really deep down in the core of the earth, who does it belong to? And then we have common concern of mankind. And so there are two types of benefit sharing platforms. There's a common heritage. This belongs to all of humanity. And common concern of mankind is where we as humanity need to be concerned about how we share goods. And this applies particularly to biodiversity. So common heritage is enshrined in law, international law. And it states that irrespective of the prowess of any country, the resources that are in international regions or non-jurisdictional regions should be shared equally between all of humanity. So this aims to be fair and to share international resources equally. So if you find something in international waters, there is a law that defines how those resources will be equitably shared throughout all nations, irrespective of the prowess of the nations involved. Then we have common concern, and that's really Nagoya, and that's benefit sharing in terms of access to biological diversity. And biodiversity is considered to be jurisdictional. In other words, if you're looking for a plant or an animal in a particular country, it falls under the sovereign governance of that country, and therefore that country can determine what the terms of engagement are and what the relationship between the prospector and the local community. And this aims to retard exploitation and incentivize protection of biodiversity, which is a common concern to humanity. So these are the foundational principles. Now, human or clinical research doesn't particularly fall into, oh, sorry, I forgot to say that these preceding sharing platforms are all enshrined in governance and protected by legal documents. Now, when it comes to clinical research, global research involves the human subjects and their genetic resources is not subject to binding regulations, but subject to ethical guidelines by various international committees. It tends to be treated under the common heritage pattern. In other words, human biological resources is a resource of and should benefit the whole of humanity, but it lacks a legal framework. So we tend to talk about altruism in the benefits of human health research. So donating your sample for human health research is considered to be an altruistic gesture, an individual's contribution to the advancement of medicine for all of humanity. Ethicists, though, agree that research participants and their communities ought to benefit of the profits generated by sponsors, especially if the resource was obtained from the developing world, where basic amenities can often be appalling. So let's look at the blind side of this altruism debate. When you're involved in a research project, you have the idea, perhaps say somewhere in Africa. You seek funding. You go out, you get your funding, you do your field work, your patient care, your consent, your recruitment and follow-up, you manage your patients. Samples and clinical information are generated. Analysis takes place. It goes through nowadays genomic analysis, and sample and data start to leave Africa. Now, at this point, we start to lose control. Data is mined for possible biomarkers by both perhaps the primary and secondary users. And we question return of results here. Who do the results return to? Then we have publication and academic currency, which is earned. That's how we get promoted as academics. So that's our academic currency. And then there's another line here. Perhaps our colleagues in international institutions benefit up to this point. Africans stop there. Our collaborators go a few steps further. And then we start moving into the innovation hub. Our colleagues abroad will discover something, they go into their innovation hub, intellectual property rights and patents start getting generated with or without their African partners. Experimental technology or therapeutic modalities are conceptualized. Big industry comes into the game. Pipelines get developed. Commercialization and beneficiation goes to whom? We don't know. And so these are the sort of issues that we really need to unpack on the continent. And we need to find out how this final endpoint here is going to benefit the people on the ground. So what are the governing issues in biobanking? Of course, the samples, the data, sovereignty, human rights, intellectual property rights, as I just pointed out, and beneficiation. So we need to talk about storage of samples and data into posterity. That's new. We never had this issue before. We also have to start thinking about conversion of samples to cell lines. That's another major ethical issue. We need to talk about specific and broad consent. What does that actually mean for us in Africa when we talk about that pipeline of the biohub? We need to talk about the movement of samples and data out of the bank to unknown sites globally for secondary use. Then these whole sticky issues have not really been thought out clearly. Commercialization, return of results, and endpoint beneficiation. So what types of collaborations are there? The first type is the collaboration between developed world countries. Big science, equal between equals, is governed by complex intellectual property rights and patenting laws. We don't get involved in this in Africa. The next line is collaboration between the developed world and us. Global health, no legal framework other than guidelines. It's subject to emerging trends in global justice. And then we can talk about collaborations that exist during public health emergencies. So the knowledge economy is driven mainly by equal prowess collaborators, big science, big data. Common heritage principles apply, but it's driven by serious commercial incentives. So here we talk about the Human Genome Project, for example. It started in 1990, ended in 2003. And look at the outputs of the Human Genome Project. In about 10 years, 3.8 billion was invested by the developed countries that were involved, and they realized almost 800 billion in return in economic impact, creation of thousands of jobs, and launching the genomic revolution. So this is the bioeconomy. And we in Africa need to start thinking about how these things are accrued and how benefits are acquired. So big science was possible because of advances in molecular technology, advances in accelerated computing, age of collaborative, highly competitive and open sharing concepts, something I'll touch on in a minute. And then these changing ethical paradigms of broad or dynamic consent. It's very complex because in the developed world, you have whole departments that are talking about intellectual property rights and patenting laws. Very complex discussions, which we have yet to really sink our teeth into in Africa. There are even open access accords. There were the Bermuda Accords, which talks about the automatic release of sequence data within 24 hours. Then you had the Fort Lauderdale, which said, okay, hold on. We need to allow you to publish before you can release your data. And then the Toronto Agreement in 2009 said, wow, we need to start including, apart from sequence data, we need to include metadata and clinical data. So you can see the trend. So the open access principle was born out of the fact that rapid release of pre-publication data has served the field of genomics very well and the generation of knowledge economy. So should go beyond just genomics and should include clinical information. So the trending now with the major global funders like Wellcome Trust and the NIH is we expect our funded researchers to maximize the availability of research data, software and materials with as few restrictions as possible. And the moratoriums between generating data and publications are getting shorter and shorter. So, the second type of collaboration is between the developed world and the third world, like us in Africa. And that's more amenable to the principles of the Aristotelian justice systems, where we talk about different kinds of justice. We talk about commutative justice, distributive justice, procedural justice, and corrective justice. So what is commutative justice? That simply says, I give you something, but I engage in a mutual agreed terms of engagement. In other words, I give you a plant from Africa, you take it and you bioprospect it, you sequence it. If you generate anything and there's commercial product, then we're going to share it. That's simply what commutative justice talks about and requires prior informed consent. And this is what Nagoya Protocol is all about. It has certain weaknesses, because generally the people that are prospecting are coming from the high-income countries, and the people that are being prospected don't really understand their rights and are bargaining from a position of weakness. So we need to take that into consideration as ethicists. Now we come to the major type of justice, distributive. Distributive justice produces a benefit-sharing rationale that is focused on improving the health needs of the vulnerable research communities where the research is being done. It acknowledges that not everybody is equal. The principle of distributive justice implies that all of society and citizens on this planet have a duty to people in serious need. So this is not just a straightforward bargaining relationship. Global justice and the evolving conscious development of globalization paradigms will no longer tolerate inequity on the scale as we have it today. Gaps in determinants of health must be addressed to improve social conditions and the poor health facilities in developing countries. So who is responsible for distributive justice? Who manages or performs benefit sharing in research? Is it the PI? Is it the academic centers? Is it the states from where the funding is coming from? Is it the funders that are responsible for the funding? Is it the industry? Is it philanthropists? Many believe that sponsors have the obligation to facilitate procedural justice for benefit sharing in low to middle income countries. So who figures out how to effect the beneficiation and how much and in what form should it take? It's not going to happen automatically. We need to sit down and talk about it. And that's where procedural justice comes into play. It deals with the process or the procedures that are involved in order to realize fair outcomes in the distribution process. Procedural justice, like in bioprospecting research, requires prior informed consent. People need to sit around a table and understand what you're doing before you actually engage in research. And these mutually agreed terms requires that the host communities or their representatives negotiate with the sponsors for fair benefit. So the playing field is not level. And there is no half-time change of sides. Africa is forever on the downside. I wish, halfway through the game we could get on that side and the developed world could get on this side, but it doesn't happen that way. So we're always playing uphill. And that's a very tiring thing to do. So why is the playing field not level, and why will open science work against African development? In principle, I'm not saying open science is not beneficial. I'm saying in principle, the way it operates at the moment needs to be redefined. Well, Africa has suffered a series of catastrophic events, 500 years of slavery, 100 years of colonialism, creation of 54 arbitrary states, putting all kinds of ethnic groups together into one country, which has created endless political conflict. As we speak in Africa today, there are wars, ethnic wars going on all over the continent, which is retarding our progress. Division of Africa down colonial lines. In West Africa, we have all countries speaking different languages. Difficult for us to communicate with each other. Now we have neocolonialism. And the latest thing is this permissive banking havens and illicit flow of funds out of Africa. So Africa has suffered what we call arrested development, 500-year gap in Africa's progress on the global scene. Look, for example, at the surrogate marker of pathologists on the continent. If you examine this map carefully, I'll summarize it here. In the US, there are 15,000 pathologists for there are one pathologist for 19,000 people in the US. In UK, there's one pathologist for 15,000 people. In Africa, there's an average of one pathologist for every 2.5 million people. And I know some countries that don't have a single pathologist. So that's the kind of example of the gap between the developed and the underdeveloped world. When you do the mathematics, and I'll just summarize it here, Africa is 5,000-fold undercapacitated. So those are major issues. So we need a corrective kind of justice. Slavery was an injustice. Colonialism was an injustice. Apartheid was an injustice. Neocolonialism is an ongoing injustice. And we're not, innocent ourselves. Corrupt African politicians who stash their funds in foreign banks is a heinous crime. So partnerships can never be equal, not for at least the next 500 years. So when we talk about equality, I don't think we can use open source in the current form to talk about equal— African PIs commit economic sabotage. lack of uniformity or policies on access and principles of sample and data sharing from Africa, scientists tend to act independently and competitively with each other on the continent. They're easily coerced into shipping samples and data out of Africa in return for funding and academic currency. So you find even our own academics are committing sabotage because we don't have a uniform voice or a uniform platform or a uniform understanding. So let me quickly talk about the H3 model. It's a large consortium funded by NIH Wellcome Trust. It's neither directly commutative or distributive. It focuses on capacity building in the institutions. It has research projects all over the continent, lots of activity going on, and introduces the novel concept of broad consent with the caveat of the access committee that gives confidence to the local ethics committees that sign off the ethics submissions, and access, benefit, and sharing is upheld by the access committee. It defines moratoriums for release of data and biospecimens that seem appropriate for Africa. Its emphasis is access to broad spectrum of African research samples, secondary big data by third parties for secondary use in return for human and institutional strengthening in Africa, rather than direct beneficence to communities through a mutually agreed term process. So it has a series of governance documents that have taken a long time to develop. They're very complex, they're very detailed, they're still ongoing. And this is how it flows. This is the H3 project. Specimens are collected from the projects. They go to the biobanks, and there are 3 biobanks in Uganda, Nigeria, and South Africa. And then the data is sent to the BioNet, which is in Cape Town. And then from the BioNet, the data is moved to the European Genome Archive. And from there, it will be accessed by international requesters. And there are moratoriums you will have to go through the access committee to ensure that there is fair incentive for you to generate capacity on the continent. So that's how the samples are distributed. In West Africa, they go to the biobank in Nigeria. In East Africa, they go to the biobank in Uganda. And South Africa, they go to Southern Africa, they go to the biobank in South Africa, where they are kept. And then the data is sent to the European Genome Archive. These are slides courtesy of H3 Africa. So this is how it will work. Somebody looks at the catalog online, decides that he wants access to a sample set or a data set. That request goes to the Data Biospecimen and Access Group. It's either rejected because it doesn't have enough African capacity in its proposal, or it's approved if the DBAC is satisfied that the requester from abroad is going to invest time and energy in improving capacity on the continent. If it is approved, it goes to the Secretariat. The Secretariat then instructs the biobank or the data archive to release the sample or the data to the requester. That's in principle how it works. And these are the moratoriums that are in place. 2 minutes? Okay. So the modified open access module of H3 talks about broad consent. It's a form of broad consent. And that broad consent is to make samples accessible to the international community. And the DBAC is supposed to give the ethics committee the confidence that it will adjudicate properly over requests by the international community. It could work well if managed properly. Now, let me quickly touch on ethical concerns during public health emergencies. So Sierra Leone, for example, is one of the countries hardest hit by the Ebola outbreak. A very rich country, but yet many aspects of Sierra Leone will wonder why it is one of the poorest countries in the world. So the Ebola outbreak started with one child playing with bats, and he contracted Ebola. And at the end of that, 28,000 cases were reported, 11,000 deaths from 3 countries. And this is the kind of poor rural infrastructure that you see in those countries in West Africa, in the rural communities. Very, very poor medical infrastructure and lack of medical personnel. Now, it could have been presented on many occasions, but there was a very long time between when it first arose to when it was actually declared as an outbreak. So you're seeing a distance of about, this slide just shows, is a WHO graphic, which shows how the outbreak spread over a period of 2 or 3 years across 3 countries. And I put the map of South Africa there, just so you get an idea of if that was happening in South Africa, how would we cope? Cases are just popping up all over the country, thousands of cases. Would we have the infrastructure to cope with this kind of scenario, even in the developed country, a relatively developed country like South Africa? So in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, these were the typical scenes: death on the roadside, death in makeshift facilities. Finally, death at the end, towards the end of the outbreak. There were well-organized treatment centers, but people were still dying. Some were able to come out alive. Now, Sierra Leone, for example, was recolonized by a biosecurity event. All these boxes show the number of partners that came into Sierra Leone to do and to contribute to the outbreak scenario. And they all acquired samples and data, and many of these samples and data left the region. So there was a massive movement of Ebola samples out of West Africa, creating a global virtual biobank of West African Ebola samples. Who is monitoring the activity around these samples and the beneficiation that's been derived from these samples? So poverty and exploitation are the biggest biosecurity risk and threat to global peace. And these kind of scenarios should not be seen anywhere on this planet. So there's a paradox of infrastructure. We talk about biocontainment facilities. These are the kinds of biocontainment facilities that you require to address a public health emergency. But when you look at the global distribution, there are 1,356 BSL-3 biocontainment facilities identified in the United States. And in West Africa, or Africa, where we see most of the emerging infectious diseases that are capable of causing a public health emergency, there are very few. We only identified 3 labs in West Africa. We found 15 BSL-4s in the United States, 10 in Europe, 3 in India, 3 in Australia, and only 1 in South Africa. There is no functional BSL-4 anywhere in equatorial Africa. This is the calamity of public health crisis in Liberia. They had 1,700 healthcare workers before Ebola. 180 of them died. That left them with 1,500. In Sierra Leone, 220 died. In Guinea, 94 died. In countries where you have severe manpower problems, you now have outbreaks that are taking out the frontliners, who are we, the healthcare professionals. So this is the profile of what happened during the Ebola outbreak. You can see that this is the outbreak, and the trials kicked in right at the end of the outbreak. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Really, this is what we should be seeing. We should be seeing the trials on the uprise of the outbreak. So you should have the ethics committees coming in, the clinical trials set up, movement of sample and data, and collaborations all happening on this side of the outbreak, not on the downside. What we did in Ebola at the end of the outbreak, by the time we set up the clinical trials and gained access to samples and all those kind of things, the outbreak was over. So this is the kind of trend that we need to see if we're going to properly address public health crisis. So you have the ethical dilemma. I'll soon finish. Some people talk about relaxed ethics during public health crisis, but we're advocating for heightened ethics. And we believe that ethicists should be part of the public health response team. The experience we had in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, and Nigeria was that the ethics committees were rapidly overwhelmed by the requests, and they couldn't cope. So we're talking about heightened ethics and not relaxed ethics. So during a public health crisis, part of the response team need to be ethicists who are involved and au fait with public health crisis. I don't think that the principles are different between routine public health and public health emergencies. We just need to be able to rehearse them before the crisis, and put in place a heightened ethical response mechanism. So my concluding thoughts. China, India, and Brazil have a really opposing concept of open access. They're closed. And we'll be interested to see those members of you who are here from these countries to talk about how you adjudicate access to data and sample. It's our opinion that it is almost the opposite of open access. So which model should we use in Africa? Open access or the China-India closed model? He who pays the piper calls the tune. It's a natural law. What we really need to do in Africa is to encourage our governments to meet their obligations under the Abuja Declaration, which is to put more money into healthcare and healthcare research and development. So we need to build trust, and we're entering the fourth industrial revolution. And we talk about trust. Trust between collaborators or trust between countries hasn't served Africa well up till this point in time. But there's an opportunity to embed trust in the digital age. And that's one of the concepts of the fourth industrial revolution, where trust becomes embedded in processes to ensure that value chain management from source to commercialization is accounted for. So the fourth industrial revolution could work well for the African continent. Now, community engagement, we talk about community engagement. What are we actually engaging the community about? Are we just telling them that we're going to look after your samples properly? That's not their concern. Their concern is that I'm living in a part of Africa where I have no access to health. I have no access to running water. I have no access to vaccination. So don't tell me about stigmatization, or don't tell me about my samples are going to be safe, or that you're not going to be able to identify who I am. I don't really care if you identify who I am. Just give me health access for my children. Just give me a primary healthcare center. Give me schools and running water and electricity. And those are the type of things I think community engagement should be engaged in. So recommendations for the health sector: the tendency to push developed world policies on low to middle income countries. Generally, I feel that, or many of us feel that we're uninformed in terms of the evolving debate around the principles of distributive justice. We need to contextualize appreciation of why things are the way they are in Africa. We're not underdeveloped for nothing. There are reasons for it, and African PIs really need to get harmonized. And I just want to thank the members of the H3 Africa Data, Biospecimen, and Access Committee, who have really, I've learned a lot from them. This is a purely African committee. All of them are experts in their own rights. And when we deliberate in the H3 Africa Access Committee, we actually deliberate for hours and hours. And I have learned a huge amount of information from my very well-endowed academic colleagues. And I just want to thank the members of the GET consortium who operate all over the continent. And many of the views that I have expressed are the expressed views of the GET Africa consortium. And thank you very much for your attention.